Colorado 1983, cold case solved. Arrest shocks the Denver area. That is the headline, and it is real enough to pull a whole city to a stop. A case older than many of the officers who worked it. A face that faded from flyers but never left the home where her family kept a bedroom ready. Her name is Lena Harrell, 24. An aspiring photographer with a secondhand Nikon, a dented Volkswagen, and a calendar circled for an art show she never made. The place is Denver, Colorado. The year is 1983. The result is an arrest in Arvada in the present day. The man is Thomas Ray Kincaid, 62, a retired postal worker who waved at every porch on his route. Here is how it broke. Touch DNA on a leather camera strap survived 4 decades in a paper envelope inside an evidence box. A lab scientist lifted a partial profile. Forensic genealogy turned a faint signal into a family tree. Branch by branch, cousin by cousin, the lines narrowed to one address with a white fence and a tan brick facade. That is where the morning came. The arrest happened at sunrise. Frost on the lawn, a yard flag that read "Welcome" in faded block letters. Detectives approached the stoop, body cameras humming. The door opened. Kincaid stood in slippers, a mug in his hand, steam rising like a breath in winter. When he heard the name, Lena Harrell, he did not frown or fumble. He did not ask what this was about. His eyes dropped to the mug. Coffee sloshed over his knuckles. He whispered, "I figured someday you would come." That single line hit Denver like a bell. Neighbors stepped into the street in coats over pajamas. Someone whispered that he used to bring their kids lollipops at Christmas. Someone else said the kind man with the exact change counter had once helped push a stalled minivan out of the snow. The knock still echoed on the door when the rumor took its first breath. Could a person who lives this quietly carry a secret that loud? The facts come first. Lena disappeared on a cold night in November 1983. Her car was found near Cherry Creek Trail, doors locked, camera bag inside. 3 days later, she was recovered from the scrub along the water, less than a mile downstream. A camera strap lay half buried in leaves. The strap went into a bag, then into a box, then onto a shelf. Time did its slow work. People moved. Detectives retired. A mother kept the porch light on. What changed after all those years was small and stubborn. A technician tested older exhibits with newer chemistry. The strap gave back skin cells that nobody had hoped for anymore. The partial DNA did not ring a bell in the criminal databases. Forensic genealogy bridged that gap. It built a lattice of relatives from public records and shared matches. It pointed not to a stranger passing through, but to a man who had passed everyone's doorstep for 30 years. This is the outcome. Kincaid in handcuffs on the front walkway. A late-life arrest that pulled at an old stitch in the city's memory. A booking photo that sits beside a black and white of Lena, hair tucked behind one ear, eyes fixed on something outside the frame. An arraignment. A community asking how a case this cold could still burn. But to understand this moment, we need to go back to where it began. Before the leaf bags and the paper evidence seals, before the lab machines that hum like refrigerators, there is a neighborhood south of downtown that smelled like wet concrete after a storm. There are cafes with corkboards that held handwritten ads for guitar lessons and pet sitting. There are narrow streets where the winter light falls flat and clean across windshields. In that light, Lena worked, studied, and shot the city she loved. Denver in the early 1980s felt wide and unfinished to her. Big sky, sharp sun, rail yards and creeks and alleys that held texture. Her friends remember 3 details. She cut her own bangs with a pair of red kitchen scissors. She stored film in a shoebox labeled Winter Light. She wore the same denim jacket with a square patch at the elbow, sewn by her father, a man whose hands were as steady as his voice. The night she vanished had the kind of cold you taste in your teeth. She left a student gallery near Spear, told 2 classmates she would drop off her prints and meet them for pie. She never made the turn. She did not call. The Volkswagen surfaced by the trail with the driver's seat pushed back an inch farther than she liked it. That inch would bother her mother for years. Police worked fast at first. The creek banks, the trailheads, the dumpsters behind the gallery and the diner. Searchers moved shoulder to shoulder through brittle grass that brushed their jeans. Volunteers found nothing. They found nothing for 3 days. On the 4th morning, a jogger paused for a rock that was not a rock. It was the heel of a shoe under willow branches. Officers stepped into the brush. yellow tape unspooled against gray trees. The scene gave them a path and a problem. They took the obvious things: clothing, fibers, hair, the camera bag, the strap. They took swabs from beneath her nails. They took soil from her palms and soil from the creek bank to compare. They did what they could with the tools that existed. They did not have the ones that did not exist yet. Evidence matters because it moves the story without asking permission. The strap matters because skin leaches into leather over time and stays there, hidden from light. Processing matters because contamination kills. The lab logged, cut, and sealed. The why matters because juries do not care about miracles, they care about method. The years did what years do. Leads cooled, witnesses moved, rumors hardened into lore. People said there was a man in a pickup who flicked his brights near the trail. People said there was a fight at the cafe about a stolen print. People said they saw Lena at a bus depot 2 towns over, hair dyed dark, wearing a coat she never owned. None of that held against the paper facts. What held was routine. A mother who called the detective on the first Monday of each month, then on the first of each year, when the calls felt like they hurt more than they helped. A rookie who asked to read the file, then left a sticky note on the cover that said, "Check the camera again." A technician who made a list titled, "Projects for Rainy Days," and wrote "Strap" at number 3. The break has a date and an hour. A lab bench wiped with ethanol. A small square cut from a corner of leather that had not been touched since the first cataloging. A chemical bath that pulled cells loose the way the creek pulled leaves in fall. An amplification run that built ladders out of fragments. Then a chart on a monitor that showed peaks where there had been only noise. Forensic genealogy does not find a person. It finds people who share parts of a person. A cousin who uploaded a profile to learn where his grandparents came from. An aunt who tested to find a biological father. Those threads tie once, then twice, then again, until a branch points toward a city, then a street, then a house with a wind chime shaped like a sparrow. The science is clean. The interpretation is human. Detectives did not knock until they built more than a tree. They pulled route maps from old postal schedules. They matched those lines to the trailheads where Lena shot early morning fog and late afternoon shadow. They found a work order from 1983 that placed Kincaid near a repair on the same week Lena disappeared. They found a complaint logged about a mailbox jam 2 blocks from the gallery, each piece small. Each piece necessary. Each piece answering the most common defense, which is this: "I touched that object once, but it meant nothing." Benign contact. That phrase lives in courtrooms. The timeline lives louder. Then came the morning, the slippers, the coffee, the line that felt like a confession and is not one, not yet. Then came the ride downtown. Then came the press conference where a captain read from a podium and said the name Lena with a care that made the room quiet. He explained the method in 1 sentence. He explained the arrest in 2. He did not explain the human part, because that belongs to the family. If you stand on the creek trail today, you hear water over stone and the distant thrum of traffic. You see bikes glide by in bright jackets. You smell cottonwood and damp earth. It is hard to imagine the place as a scene. It is harder to imagine the person responsible living among the same sounds and smells for decades, waving at porches, counting addresses, returning home for dinner right on time. Outcome first, an arrest, charges pending. A name that once meant envelopes and weather calendars now means something else. A camera strap that sat in the dark and waited for the light. A city that thought it had forgotten but had not. But this story did not start with an arrest. It started with a young woman and a town that felt bigger than she was, and a plan to show the world how light moves across water. But to understand this moment, we need to go back to where it began. If you like cases where one overlooked clue flips a whole town, you are in the right place. Before the crime scene, before the evidence bags, there was a life. And before the headlines, there was a city trying to find itself. Denver, 1983, wasn't the postcard skyline people know now. The mountains were the same, but the city below them was in transition. Steel bones of new office towers rising, while old brick warehouses still breathed dust and diesel. The air had that high, dry edge that makes sound travel farther and skin crack faster. It was a working city, rough around the edges, but full of people convinced they were living on the brink of something better. That's where Lena Harrell was trying to make a name. 24 years old, a transplant from Pueblo with an eye for composition and a streak of quiet defiance that made her both charming and impossible to steer. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a florist shop on South Broadway, the kind of space where you could smell carnations through the floorboards and hear the 2 a.m. deliveries roll down the alley. Her friends said she was meticulous. Film canisters labeled with white tape and black marker fog, dusk, people waiting, coffee always black. Alarms set 15 minutes early so she could chase the morning light before work. She freelanced part-time for the Denver Sentinel, shooting storefronts, parades, minor league games, anything that paid for film and rent. But her heart belonged to her own photos, long exposures of creeks and trails, reflections on wet pavement, city lights bleeding into sky. People who knew her remember 3 things. Her laugh sharp, quick, then gone. Her camera always around her neck, even when she wasn't shooting. And her jacket denim, faded to gray-blue, with a corduroy collar and a single button that didn't match. Neighbors said Lena didn't scare easy. She walked alone, late, often carrying gear that looked too expensive for someone her age. When asked if she worried, she'd shrug and say the world's full of people, not all of them bad. Optimism that sounds braver now than it probably felt then. The Denver art scene in the early 80s was small but hungry. Basement galleries in Capitol Hill, warehouse exhibits near the rail yards, a few ambitious cafes that doubled as performance spaces. It was there, among local painters and would-be poets, that Lena started to get noticed. She had a solo wall at the Mercury Collective 8 prints, all shot along Cherry Creek Trail. Muted colors. Long shadows. Her style had patience. She waited for the light to come to her. That show was supposed to open on November 10th. She never saw it hang. Lena's parents, Ray and Miriam Harrell, still lived in Pueblo. Her father was a machinist at the rail yard. Her mother taught 2nd grade. They'd raised 3 kids, Lena, the middle one, the quiet achiever between an older brother who joined the Air Force and a younger sister who played drums in a local bar band. Ray said Lena was the kid who could fix anything if you let her think first. She'd rebuilt a Polaroid when she was 14, using parts from a broken slide projector. Miriam said she was born looking at the world through a frame. They talked to her every Sunday evening. Calls that lasted exactly 20 minutes because Lena kept quarters in a small ceramic bowl beside her phone. The last call came November 6th. Her mother remembered her sounding distracted but happy. She mentioned developing film late, finishing prints for the show, maybe heading out to Cherry Creek in the morning if the weather held. Nothing in that conversation sounded like an ending. Cherry Creek Trail isn't far from downtown. It winds east along the water, a narrow corridor of cottonwoods and bike paths cutting through neighborhoods that still held traces of farmland then. In the 80s, it wasn't yet the manicured path. It would become more weeds, more graffiti, more dark pockets where the streetlights didn't reach. Photographers loved it because the light there changed fast. Police remembered it because every year, someone reported something strange along its banks. Lena shot there often. People had seen her balancing on the low concrete ledge at dawn, camera pointed toward the bridges where the city's reflection pooled in the current. That habit, investigators would later say, probably put her there the night she vanished. The problem was, nobody saw her go. The Denver PD files described that week in clean, clipped typewriter lines. Victim last seen leaving Mercury Collective approximately 10:15 p.m. Vehicle recovered 11:42 p.m. by patrol unit near trail access. Keys not located, purse found on floorboard. Her camera bag was on the passenger seat. Inside, 2 undeveloped rolls, 1 empty film canister, and a note that read simply, "Creek Lights Long Exposure Test." To detectives, it looked like she'd planned to shoot 1 more frame before heading home. The first hours matter most in any disappearance. They were gone before police realized what kind of case this was. By morning, Ray and Miriam were driving up from Pueblo. By afternoon, volunteers from the art school were stapling flyers to telephone poles. By evening, local TV had the story. Young photographer missing car found by trail. For Denver, it was the kind of story that sticks. A creative woman gone, no witnesses, no struggle, nothing but the car and the camera strap that later turned out to be everything. The trail became a crime scene in stages. First, it was just officers walking with flashlights. Then, it was yellow tape and search dogs. Then, it was the place everyone avoided after dark. The discovery 3 days later came from a jogger who worked at a print shop downtown. He said he saw a shape where there shouldn't be one. Detectives logged the scene in cold, methodical language, but the images tell a softer truth. Frost on grass, camera flash, bouncing off ice, the creek half frozen under a gray sky. They noted bruising, no defensive wounds, and an object nearby partially buried in leaves, a broken camera strap. They bagged it, labeled it, and moved on. At the time, no one knew that small piece of leather would outlive every theory and every rumor that followed. Denver tried to move on too. By Christmas, there was another crime, another headline. By spring, the case file thinned to occasional tips that went nowhere. People still remembered her face on the posters, but memory is slippery. For most, Lena became a symbol, the girl by the creek. For her family, she was still a voice that called home every Sunday, still a daughter who hadn't finished what she started. Miriam returned to teaching. Ray retired early. They left the porch light on for years, the bulb replaced every few months like a ritual. Their youngest, Dana, kept Lena's camera sealed in a shoebox at her apartment, film still inside, never developed. What keeps a small case alive isn't luck. It's persistence in people no one remembers. A retired detective named Elliot Sloan wrote one last memo before he left the force in '96. He wrote, "The Harrell case remains unsolved. Recommend re-examination if future technology allows extraction from non-porous surfaces." The strap, being leather, counted as porous but partly sealed. He'd boxed it carefully, labeled in thick black marker, "Handle with gloves, do not discard." For decades, that box waited in an evidence room that smelled like dust and disinfectant. When it finally mattered again, the city had changed. The trail was paved, the warehouses turned into condos, and the creek that once hid a body now hosted joggers, cyclists, and food carts. The people were new, but the past still hummed under their feet. Every story about a place becomes a mirror. What it shows depends on when you look. In the '80s, Denver was proud and restless, half western town, half modern city, unsure which to be. People trusted their neighbors. They still left doors unlocked in parts of town that now have private security. They still said hello to the mailman. That's how Thomas Kincaid fit in so easily. He wasn't invisible. He was ordinary. And ordinary hides better than anything else. Decades later, when news of the arrest broke, the first question locals asked wasn't how, but who. Who could live beside them, deliver their mail, smile for their children, and carry that secret? Who could pass the creek every morning and not flinch? The second question was harder. If this man could, how many others could too? In every city, there's a case that defines an era, the story parents whisper to remind kids to be careful. In Denver, for a long time, it was the Harrell case. It haunted the trail and the galleries and anyone who walked home alone under the street lamps. For her friends, it became a line they never crossed again. No late-night walks, no solo shoots, no blind trust in small kindnesses. For her family, it was a hole that time didn't fill. For investigators, it was unfinished business, a file that stared back from the cabinet. And for the man in Arvada, it was a shadow he learned to live under until science turned over the stone. If you stand downtown today, the skyline is brighter, the murals newer, but somewhere beneath it all is still the sound of a creek at night and the echo of a shutter closing on a frame that never developed. But that's the city. The next part belongs to the moment when ordinary became final, Lena's last night, her last phone call, and the last photograph she ever took. But to understand that night, we have to see how normal it looked before everything broke. Morning, November 10th, 1983. The sky over Denver started clear, that kind of bright blue that makes people forget winter's coming. It was cold enough to see your breath, but sunlight spilled over the rooftops like honey on glass. The forecast said mild. Nobody checked what came next. Lena woke early. Neighbors heard her radio through the thin walls, a crackly station playing Fleetwood Mac. She brewed coffee, poured it into a travel mug that still sat unwashed on her counter when police searched the apartment later. She wore jeans, boots, and the jacket with the patch at the elbow. The Nikon hung from her neck, as always. She called her friend Maya Connors just before 8, asking if she could borrow a frame from the studio for the show. Maya said sure, come by after lunch. It was an ordinary conversation that would become an anchor in every timeline. From there, Lena followed her usual pattern. She stopped at Randy's diner for breakfast. 2 eggs, toast, black coffee. Randy himself remembered her. He said she left a tip too big for a student and smiled when she paid. Then she went to a local print lab, picked up 2 rolls of developed film, and returned home around 10:30. A neighbor, Mrs. Larson, saw her carrying a flat box and waved from her window. She waved back. The day went still for several hours. Investigators later found her apartment neat, half-packed for the gallery show. Prints, stacked by size. A note on her desk. Pick up foam board 3. The clock in her kitchen had stopped at 3:21 when detectives photographed it. Batteries corroded. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. But that time would come to matter. At 2:50, a clerk at the art supply depot on Lincoln Street said Lena came in, bought 2 sheets of white foam board and a tube of adhesive. Paid cash. Left at 3:07. Nothing unusual. She had a camera around her neck. Always did. From there, things start to blur. The police map shows her last known route. Lincoln to Colfax, Colfax to Spear. The gallery, the Mercury Collective, sat just off that intersection, in a low brick building painted rust red, shared with a framing shop. Inside, volunteers were hanging the show, hammering nails, adjusting lights. They said she seemed calm, focused, excited. She talked about how the evening light along the creek was changing fast that week, how the fog rolled in low around dusk and gave reflections, a silver kind of sadness. Her words, the last anyone wrote down. Around 6, she helped label her pieces, signed a release form, and grabbed her coat. Maya said she told Lena to stick around, have dinner, celebrate early. Lena smiled and said, "I just want one last shot before it gets dark." She meant it literally. Cherry Creek Trail wasn't far, 10 minutes by car, 15 if traffic was bad. It cut along Spear, past a cluster of old industrial buildings, under a viaduct that always smelled like rain and motor oil. It wasn't a place you'd call dangerous, but you wouldn't linger there after sunset either. At that hour, commuters were heading home, lights flicking on in office windows. No one remembers seeing a woman with a camera pull onto the gravel shoulder near the trailhead. But her car was found right there later that night. The Volkswagen Rabbit sat just off the path, parallel to the water. Engine cold. Doors locked. Headlights off. Keys missing. Inside, her bag on the seat. The heater knob turned halfway up. On the passenger floor, an empty thermos lid, a receipt for gas from 2 hours earlier, and a small leaf pressed flat like she'd been saving it. It was Officer Sam Torres who found the car. He'd been on patrol nearby when a cyclist called in what he thought was an abandoned vehicle. Torres checked the plates, saw the name Harrell, and remembered the flyer that had just started circulating from the gallery the show scheduled that weekend. He radioed it in at 11:42 p.m. Within 20 minutes, the scene was cordoned off. Within 30, the first detective arrived. They searched the area by flashlight, calling her name. The beam of light caught only branches, broken glass, and the glint of water. No footprints. No tire marks beyond her own. It was like she'd stepped off the earth. Her roommate, Angela Reeves, filed the missing person report the next morning. Angela said she thought Lena had gone to Maya's place after the gallery, maybe stayed late. She'd woken to sunlight through the curtains and noticed the Nikon wasn't hanging by the door where Lena always kept it. By 10, she was calling hospitals. By 11, she called the police. The first responding detective, Elliot Sloan, treated it as a routine disappearance. At first, everyone did. Young woman, late night, independent streak. Maybe she'd met someone, maybe gone off on her own. But by afternoon, the car changed the tone. By evening, Sloan had a team combing the creek banks. By midnight, volunteers with flashlights lined up along the path, moving in slow, deliberate rows. A city at night sounds different when it's searching for someone. You hear the crunch of boots, the radios, the wind in bare trees. Sometimes a dog barks in the distance, and every head turns. The first day ended with nothing but cold hands and questions. The second brought the discovery. November 13th. Early morning. The jogger's name was Peter Grant. He ran that stretch 3 times a week. Said he noticed a shape by the willows near the water, half covered in leaves. At first, he thought it was trash. Then he saw hair. He froze, stepped back, and ran to a nearby payphone. Police arrived within 10 minutes. They followed his footprints back to the creek. The ground was soft, frost layered like sugar on dirt. They found Lena lying on her side, one arm outstretched toward the water. No shoes. One earring missing. The strap from her camera twisted near her wrist, snapped clean. Sloan's report notes, no signs of struggle on site. No drag marks. No blood. No sign the body had been moved post-mortem. The creek current was too low to carry her far, but no one could say for sure whether she'd been attacked there or somewhere nearby. The coroner later recorded cause of death as asphyxiation consistent with strangulation, but the exact mechanism remained unclear due to water exposure. There was partial DNA beneath her nails, degraded. And there was that strap. The autopsy listed her time of death as late night, November 10th, within hours of leaving the gallery. The prints she'd spent months preparing were never displayed. The show opened as a memorial instead. For Denver, it became the story every parent told their daughters. Don't walk alone. Don't trust the quiet corners. The city grieved, then hardened. New locks sold out in hardware stores. Cameras hung heavier around necks. Every creek, every shadowed street became a reminder. For Ray and Miriam Harrell, grief was a job they didn't apply for but couldn't quit. They buried their daughter in Pueblo under a headstone that read, "She saw the light in everything." They left one space beside it blank for whoever was responsible. Detective Sloan kept the file on his desk longer than most. He chased every lead: the ex-boyfriend who'd moved to Oregon, the coworker who borrowed film, the delivery man who drove the same route nightly. He found nothing. By 1985, the case had gone cold. By 96, he'd be the one to box the evidence and write that note about future technology. When the news of the arrest broke decades later, the city replayed that last day in its collective mind: the breakfast, the gallery, the creek. Every line of the timeline fit together too neatly, like a story trying to make sense of itself. But one piece always stayed missing: her final photograph. The roll inside her Nikon was never found. Police searched the creek, the car, the apartment. No film. No negatives. Just an empty canister, labeled "Creek Lights Long Exposure Test." Whatever she shot that night, whatever she saw through her lens, vanished with her. And maybe that's why the case held so long in people's minds. Because somewhere out there might still be one frame left undeveloped. One image that knew the truth before anyone else did. Morning of November 11th, 1983. The frost on the trail had already melted when the first organized search began. The sun came out sharp and colorless, bouncing off the creek's surface like glass. It should have been an ordinary Friday. Instead, half of Denver seemed to be holding its breath. Detective Elliot Sloan was running on black coffee and 4 hours of sleep. He'd already walked the area twice the night before and had come back at dawn to supervise volunteers. They met in a parking lot near Cherry Creek Drive, a loose crowd of officers, students, and strangers who'd seen the flyer on TV. The flyer showed Lena's senior portrait, cropped close to her eyes, serious, unflinching. Underneath, "Missing. Last seen Thursday night near Cherry Creek Trail. Any information, please call." By 8 a.m., Sloan had split the group into zones. Officers took the embankments and culverts. Volunteers swept the bike path in lines, 10 feet apart, calling her name into the morning air. The sound carried down the creek and came back thin, like an echo that didn't want to return. Miriam and Ray Harrell stood off to the side, watching. She clutched a thermos she didn't drink from. He stared at the water. They'd driven up from Pueblo overnight and gone straight to the police station, where they were told to wait. Nobody ever really waits. They hover, drift, look for something to do with their hands. Miriam tried to hand out muffins she'd packed, as if feeding the searchers might summon her daughter faster. By noon, news trucks had arrived. Reporters with scarves and microphones turned the quiet trail into a stage. Another young woman missing. Last seen heading to photograph the creek. The story played on every channel that evening. Lena's face, the car, the jacket. Denver hadn't seen this kind of attention since the city's last big case 5 years earlier, and this one felt closer, smaller, personal. The first real lead came from a jogger who'd been on the trail around 10:30 the night she vanished. He told police he saw a car parked with its hazard lights on and thought someone might be fixing a flat. He remembered the car's color, pale yellow, but not the make. He'd heard no shouts, no engine noise, just the rush of the creek and the wind through dry grass. When Sloan showed him a photo of Lena's Volkswagen, he nodded slowly. "Could be," he said. "Looked like that." Sloan's report from that day is clinical but carries an undertone of urgency. Search continues downstream. No sign of victim. Media presence escalating. Family cooperative but highly distressed. The search expanded outward fields, service roads, drainage ditches. Police helicopters buzzed overhead, their rotors scattering crows. Mounted units combed the brush. 9 handlers from the state patrol joined in, the dogs straining at their leads, tails rigid, nostrils twitching. By mid-afternoon, one of the dogs alerted near a cluster of willows, the same area where she'd eventually be found 3 days later. But the scent trail stopped at the water's edge, and with dusk approaching, they marked it with flag tape and pulled back. That night, the temperature dropped below freezing. Sloan called it off at 9 p.m. He stood at the edge of the tape, flashlight beam trembling slightly in his hand, and muttered to no one, "She's here somewhere." It wasn't the first time he'd said that. It wouldn't be the last. While police searched, the community rallied. Maya Connors and other artists from the gallery printed new flyers with clearer photographs. The print shop on Blake Street ran them for free. College students handed them out door to door in Capitol Hill. Local radio stations read her description every hour. By the end of the weekend, Lena's face was everywhere: gas stations, bus stops, the grocery store, bulletin boards. A city looking into mirrors and seeing the same missing girl. That kind of collective anxiety changes the rhythm of a place. People walked faster. Locks sold out at hardware stores. Women stopped jogging alone. Evening classes emptied early. It wasn't panic yet, but it was the shadow of it. On November 12th, 2 uniformed officers knocked on every door within a mile radius of the trail. Most residents had nothing useful to say. But one, a janitor named Martin Hale, mentioned something odd. He worked nights at the nearby rail yard and said that around midnight Thursday, he'd seen a man walking along the access road carrying something long and dark, maybe a tripod. He remembered because the figure turned toward his flashlight, then vanished behind the trees. Hale couldn't describe his face, only that he wore a uniform-style jacket. That note went into the report. A uniform jacket. Tripod-shaped object. No follow-up, not then. The city had too many false leads to chase. The next day, the panic broke open. Word spread that the police had found her car but not her camera. News anchors repeated it like a curse. The camera became a symbol proof that she might still be out there, hurt, hiding, documenting her own survival. By Sunday evening, volunteers had tripled. Church groups, students, off-duty firefighters. The trail was a mosaic of neon vests and flashlights. The creek reflected all of it, a moving constellation of desperate light. When her body was found the following morning, the searchers didn't cheer or cry. They just stopped moving. The sound drained out of the day, and the panic that had been hanging in the air turned inward, quiet and heavy. The crime scene drew more media than any in recent memory. Reporters pressed against the tape. Helicopters hovered. Cameras clicked like rain. Every station ran the same footage that night, officers lifting a stretcher through the brush, the creek behind them, the yellow tape flapping in the wind. In the days that followed, Denver slipped into a strange half-silence. Bars turned down their music. Gallery openings were canceled. For weeks, people left flowers and candles near the spot where she'd been found. Someone hung a photograph, one of Lena's own prints laminated and nailed to a tree. It showed the creek in spring, sunlight scattering on the surface. Below it, a note in marker. "You found the light again." Detective Sloan ran the case hard. He interviewed everyone from the gallery. Friends, classmates, ex-boyfriends, the mailman. No lead stuck. DNA analysis in the 80s was primitive, expensive, and unreliable. The samples under Lena's nails degraded fast. The lab couldn't make sense of them. Sloan tried fingerprints on the car, the camera bag, the door handle. Nothing matched anyone in the system. He did find one thing. A partial boot print in the mud near the creek, size 11, heavy tread. It didn't match Ray's, didn't match any of the searchers. They photographed it, cast it, logged it. That print would sit in storage for 40 years, waiting for the day it would line up with a postal issue work boot, the kind worn by Thomas Kincaid on his route. But Sloan didn't know that. He only knew he was running out of time, out of witnesses, out of daylight. For the Harrells, those first weeks passed like a fever. They stayed in Denver until after Christmas, meeting with detectives, attending vigils, answering letters from strangers who said they'd dreamed about Lena and knew where to look. Some tips were cruel. Some were delusional. A few were just sad people needing to believe their own tragedies connected to hers. The Harrells listened, thanked them, went back to their motel, and stared at the wall. When the holidays ended, they drove home to Pueblo with the trunk half full of flowers and cards. The investigation stayed behind. Looking back now, the early search reads like the city's attempt to hold its innocence in its hands and watch it slip away. People wanted a simple story, a stranger passing through, a crime of opportunity, something that could be solved and set aside. But the truth, when it finally surfaced decades later, wasn't simple. It lived among them. It wore a uniform. It said good morning and waved. That's the cruel symmetry of cold cases. The harder a city looks outward, the more likely the answer waits quietly inside. The panic faded, as panic always does. Life returned in slow fragments, traffic noise, coffee shops, laughter on sidewalks. But beneath the surface, Denver was different. The trail stayed quiet for years. The creek still ran, but fewer people walked beside it. Detective Sloan retired in the mid-90s, leaving behind that single note, "Re-examine when technology allows." He didn't know he was writing a prophecy. He just couldn't let it go. After the search came the silence. The kind of silence that makes every sound suspicious. Every creak, every passing car, every knock at the door. For the Harrells, it was the kind of quiet that hums inside the skull, a steady, aching tone that never stops. Detective Elliot Sloan called it the long gray period. No new leads. No new evidence. Just the same trail, the same photos, the same unanswerable questions. By winter of '84, the city had folded the story into its background noise. The headlines moved on. But inside the department, the file never settled. It lived on a shelf marked active pending, a category that meant hope but usually signaled futility. Still, hope has a way of growing roots, even when it's half dead. The first rumor came from a bartender at the Rusty Nail Tavern, a few miles from the trail. He swore a man had been in the night of November 10th, mid-30s, dark jacket, mud on his jeans, and had paid with a $20 bill that was damp, as if it had come from water. The bartender remembered because the man had said, "The creek's colder than it looks." Police chased the lead. They found the bill in the register, traced it to a bank, then to a payroll deposit. Nothing stuck. The bartender's description fit half the city. The second rumor started among the art crowd, a whisper that Lena had been having an affair with a married gallery owner, and that the night she disappeared, she'd gone to meet him by the trail. Maya Connors dismissed it immediately. She was focused on her work, she told police. She didn't have time for drama. But gossip doesn't need proof. It just needs air. And the more people repeated it, the more it began to sound like truth. The gallery owner, Eddie Warren, was interviewed twice. He admitted Lena had shown him some of her photos privately before the exhibition, but denied any relationship beyond mentorship. His alibi checked out. He'd been at dinner with his wife and 2 clients at the Brown Palace until midnight. Receipts confirmed it. Still, for months, people in the art scene lowered their voices when his name came up. A convenient villain is better than none at all. Then came the third rumor, the one that almost derailed the investigation entirely. A self-proclaimed psychic from Boulder called the department claiming she'd had visions of Lena trapped beneath ice. She named a location 15 miles upstream, near an old water treatment plant. Desperate for movement, Sloan sent a small team to check. They found only frozen mud and animal tracks. The psychic later charged the Harrells $200 for a reading. Ray tore up the check before it cleared. It was the first time anyone had seen him angry since the funeral. The official leads weren't much better. One man confessed, a drifter picked up in Colorado Springs for burglary. He told detectives he'd met a woman by a creek, that things had gotten out of hand. He gave details that matched the case too closely for coincidence. But when they checked his timeline, he'd been in county jail the night Lena disappeared. He'd read about her in a newspaper in the holding cell. False confession number 1 of 5. Cold cases attract people like that. Men who want attention, who crave punishment, or who simply can't tell fantasy from fact. Sloan learned to read them fast, the way their eyes flickered when he said the victim's name, the way they leaned forward too eagerly. The real ones went quiet. The fakes always talked too much. By spring of '84, the case file had swollen to 3 binders. Sloan's handwriting filled every margin. His wife, Marla, said he kept a map of Cherry Creek pinned above their kitchen table. He'd stare at it while he ate, tracing routes with his fork, muttering distances under his breath. Marla used to joke he was married to the wrong woman. He never laughed. He had one theory that never left him: the mail route. The trail ran parallel to several postal delivery lines. He'd noticed the same symbol, small circular ink stamps from postal bins on envelopes found in a trash can near the scene. He wrote a memo about it, suggesting someone with route access could have seen Lena often enough to learn her habits. But the idea was brushed aside. Too broad, too vague. At the time, no one connected postal schedules to homicide. It would take 40 years and a strand of DNA to prove he'd been right. Meanwhile, the Harrells tried to build a life around the hole their daughter left. Miriam returned to teaching but couldn't face classrooms filled with girls who looked like Lena, same age, same laughter, same long hair, pulled into messy buns. She transferred to administrative work within a year. Ray stayed at the rail yard until his back gave out, then took early retirement. He spent his afternoons driving aimlessly, tracing Lena's last known route, parking by the trail just to sit and watch the water move. Their youngest, Dana, dropped out of community college. She told her mother she couldn't concentrate, that every shadow looked like a warning. She started volunteering at a crisis hotline. Listening to other people's pain felt easier than facing her own. Every so often, the phone would ring with a new lead. Each one promised closure. Each one collapsed under scrutiny. There was a man who claimed he'd found Lena's camera at a pawn shop in Aurora, turned out to be a similar model, different serial number. There was a hiker who thought he'd found her missing earring near the creek, just costume jewelry. There was a woman who swore she saw Lena's ghost near the trailhead. Sloan didn't even file that one. The case grew heavier with every false hope. Then came the courier letter. December, '86. Typed on a mechanical typewriter, addressed to the parents of L. Harrell. Postmarked from Denver, no return address. It read, "You won't find peace until you stop looking where she isn't. The one who took her is gone." He wore a uniform. He said good morning. That's all I can say. Police tested the envelope for prints, found none. The paper matched a common brand sold at office supply stores. The ribbon ink suggested an older machine, possibly a Smith Corona model. It was eerie, specific, and useless. Sloan believed it came from someone close to the case, maybe a guilt-ridden witness, maybe just a prankster with too much imagination. Still, he filed it under potential witness correspondence and logged it in the evidence index. 40 years later, that letter would resurface. And the line about the uniform would land differently. By the early '90s, the Harrell case had become a local legend. New detectives cycled through, took a glance, and moved on to newer crimes. Files yellowed. The city grew taller, wealthier, busier. The creek that once swallowed light now ran beside bike paths and cafes. Joggers passed the spot daily without knowing what had happened there. Only the old-timers remembered. They still lowered their voices when the name came up. And yet, even in that silence, the story refused to die. Maya kept Lena's photographs on display every October, the ones she'd printed but never sold. The gallery changed owners twice, but the wall remained. A quiet tribute. Each year, fewer people recognized the name, but someone always stopped to read the small plaque. Taken too soon, still looking. By 1996, Sloan was 63. He walked slower, talked softer. He'd seen more death than he could count, but Lena's case was the one that haunted him. Before he retired, he spent one last week in the evidence room. He checked the old boxes, rewrote the labels, updated chain of custody logs. On the leather strap bag, he scribbled in red marker, "Keep. Future testing possible. Skin cells may remain." Then he signed his name and closed the lid. He had no idea how prophetic that note would become. In the end, That's how cold cases survive, not because of luck, not because of miracles, but because someone refused to throw away a piece of evidence that didn't look like much. A strap, a box, a line in red ink. That's all it takes for the past to keep breathing. The rumors faded. The dead ends piled up. But the story stayed alive, waiting for science to catch up to memory. And when it finally did, the shock would tear through Denver all over again. Time doesn't close a wound like this. It just builds a scar over it, thin enough that the right kind of light still shows what's underneath. From 1996 to 2019, the Harrell case slept inside a cardboard box stamped unsolved. Dust gathered. Officers transferred. Technology leapt forward, leaving behind the old labels and Polaroid photos that looked more like relics than evidence. But inside that box, inside a single envelope marked camera strap, the future waited quietly. Detective Elliot Sloan retired in March of '96. He handed over his badge, cleared his desk, and walked out with only two things: his coffee mug and a photocopy of Lena's case summary. His colleagues said he never really left the job. He'd call younger detectives every few months, asking if any new DNA programs had been approved for cold cases. He'd read about breakthroughs in Forensic Quarterly and underlined passages like scripture. Everyone humored him the polite way you humor a ghost. At home, he kept the case map folded in a kitchen drawer. Once a week, he'd pull it out, study the old photographs of the trail, and tell his wife, "She's still waiting for us." He died in 2004. At his funeral, his wife slipped a copy of that map into the casket. His colleagues didn't know it yet, but the note he'd written, "Keep for future testing," was still taped to the strap in evidence. And that note would outlive him. By the late '90s, Miriam Harrell had grown gray and thin. She still sent a Christmas card to the Denver PD every year. Same message, same handwriting. "Please don't forget Lena." It was never signed sincerely. Just, "Thank you." Detectives pinned the cards to a corkboard by the break room as a kind of moral compass, a reminder that every file meant someone's daughter, not just a case number. Ray Harrell rarely left the house. He'd drive to Cherry Creek once a month, park by the trailhead, and sit for an hour in silence. Sometimes he brought coffee for the officers assigned to patrol that stretch. He never stayed long. The only thing that changed year to year was the make of his truck and the depth of the creases in his face. Their younger daughter, Dana, eventually left Colorado, moved to Portland, married, had kids. But she never changed her phone number just in case. Every October, she'd post a photograph of her sister on social media with 3 words: "Still looking, always." Denver changed faster than memory could keep up. The warehouses near the trail turned into coffee shops. The Mercury Collective, where Lena's final exhibit was supposed to hang, became a wine bar. The old rail yard where her father worked was bulldozed into luxury condos. Newcomers jogged the same path every morning without knowing what their sneakers passed over. The plaque marking the recovery site had been removed after vandals sprayed it with graffiti in the late '90s. A city prefers its ghosts quiet. Every now and then, a true crime show would call the Harrell family, wanting to feature the case. Miriam always said no. She didn't want Lena's story to be entertainment. But time has a way of erasing modesty along with pain, and eventually, after her death in 2012, Dana gave permission. The episode aired on a cable network at 2 in the morning. It lasted 22 minutes. It ended the way most cold case documentaries do, with the words, "Anyone with information is urged to contact the Denver Police Department." Nothing came of it. Not then. 2017. Detective Rachel Monroe was 34 and tired of paperwork. She transferred from homicide to the cold case unit, hoping for a slower pace. The unit was small: 4 detectives, 1 sergeant, and an evidence technician who had been there since the '80s. They worked out of a basement room with flickering lights and no windows. The walls were lined with metal shelves stacked high with boxes, each labeled with a case number and a year. Monroe chose the Harrell file because the photograph on the box stopped her. The face didn't look dead. It looked like someone mid-thought, as if she might start talking again if you waited long enough. Monroe flipped through the contents: the Polaroids, the maps, the autopsy, the letter from '86. Then she found Sloan's red ink. "Keep for future testing." She smiled. "All right, Sloan," she muttered. "Let's see what you left me." By 2017, DNA analysis had gone from miracle to routine. What once took a team of specialists could now be done by a machine the size of a microwave. But cold cases presented a special problem: degradation. Old evidence meant old contamination, dust, heat, skin oils from the people who'd handled it decades before. Most of it was useless. Still, Monroe knew about a new technology just beginning to change the field: forensic genealogy. Unlike the old CODIS system that compared crime scene DNA against convicted offenders, genealogy built family trees from public databases. It worked on partial profiles, fragments of ancestry passed down through generations. It was expensive and experimental, but Monroe had a friend at the state lab in Fort Collins willing to take a chance. She pulled the strap from its evidence bag under sterile light. The leather was brittle, but the inner seam where it had been stitched still held traces of dried sweat. The lab tech used a microswab, collected the cells, and placed them into a vial barely large enough to see. The first attempt failed. The second produced noise. The third, 2 weeks later, produced peaks. It wasn't a full profile, but it was enough to send to the genealogy specialist. The data came back as a list of names, distant relatives scattered across the western United States. Cousins, great-grandparents, unknown connections branching like frost. The software plotted the relationships, generating a sprawling web of shared markers. From that web, one cluster stood out: a family line rooted in Colorado, stretching from the early 1900s to the present day. The name appeared again and again in census records, voter rolls, marriage licenses. Kincaid. Monroe traced it through public documents. Most of them had lived within 50 miles of Denver for generations. She narrowed it to males who would have been adults in 1983. 2 names remained. One had died in 2008. The other was alive and living quietly in Arvada. Thomas Ray Kincaid. Kincaid had worked for the Postal Service from 1976 until 2009. Married once, divorced, no children. He lived in a small tan house at the end of a cul-de-sac with a white fence and a garden full of wind chimes. Neighbors described him as polite, punctual, and fond of crossword puzzles. He retired early, citing knee problems. He volunteered at a food bank. Nobody ever had a bad word to say about him. When Monroe first saw his name, she felt nothing, just another potential match. But as she read his address, something tightened in her chest. It sat less than a mile from the route Lena used to take home from the Mercury Collective. And his old postal delivery path? Cherry Creek Trail. It took months to get the confirmation. The lab matched his DNA from a discarded coffee cup to the sample on the strap. 99.8% probability. A number that means certainty in every language of law enforcement. Monroe printed the report and stared at it. 40 years of silence broke in a single page. The case was solved, at least on paper. But it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like a hand reaching out of the past, asking if anyone had been paying attention. She called the sergeant, then the district attorney, then Lena Harrell. Dana cried for a long time before saying, "My mom would have liked to know his name." March 25, 2025. Sunrise. Arvada. Detectives approached the house with a warrant. A camera rolled. Kincaid stepped outside in slippers, holding a mug of coffee. When they said Lena Harrell, he didn't run. Didn't ask why. He just whispered, "I figured someday you'd come." Then he set the mug down and held out his hands. Inside the house, they found postal uniforms folded in a drawer, a shoebox of old photographs, landscapes, mail routes, creek banks, and one empty space on a shelf where a camera might have sat. That's how the cold years ended, not with a miracle, not with confession, but with persistence, science, and one detective who chose a box because she liked the face on it. 42 years of silence undone by one small decision. Don't throw anything away. Morning light over Denver, April 26, 2025. The city woke to headlines that didn't seem real. Mail carrier arrested in 1983 cold case. For older residents, it felt like the past had cracked open and started speaking again. Thomas Ray Kincaid, 62 years old, retired postal worker, no prior record, stood in front of a judge wearing the same calm expression he'd shown when officers took him away. The courtroom was full but silent, the kind of silence that comes before a storm breaks. He didn't deny knowing Lena Harrell. He said he used to see her sometimes when he delivered mail to her building, that she was friendly, polite, curious about everything. He claimed they'd talked about photography, about the creek. When asked directly whether he'd followed her that night, he didn't answer. He just stared at his folded hands. The district attorney's statement to the court was short and surgical. 42 years ago, Kincaid had crossed paths with a woman who was doing nothing more than taking pictures. He'd followed her, cornered her, and when she resisted, he'd taken her life. Afterward, he'd walked away, blending back into the night, back into the rhythm of a city that never suspected him. He delivered mail for another 26 years. Birth announcements, utility bills, Christmas cards. He'd handed out joy and bad news with the same steady hand that had once taken a life. Investigators pieced the story together from fragments, forensic evidence, witness interviews, old postal route maps. Kincaid's route had run parallel to Cherry Creek Trail. He'd often cut through the path after hours, avoiding traffic, smoking cigarettes in the dark. He'd seen Lena several times before that night at her apartment, at the mailbox, at the corner diner where she'd buy her morning coffee. It was routine, almost invisible. He'd memorized her schedule without meaning to. Until one evening, routine turned into opportunity. There was no long chase, no scream that broke the night. Just the sound of her camera falling against gravel. The strap snapped, leaving the trace of his skin cells on leather. He took the camera and disappeared into the darkness he'd come from. Her car keys, wrapped in masking tape, were found under a loose floorboard in his garage. Detectives believe he kept them because they made the memory feel real, something he could hold on to when everything else started to fade. Kincaid never gave a full confession. When Detective Rachel Monroe asked why he'd done it, he said, "She always smiled when she saw me. You start to think that means something." Monroe wrote in her report, "Subject shows awareness of guilt, but no true remorse. Views connection as justification rather than crime." He pled guilty to second-degree murder, avoiding trial. He was sentenced to life without parole. When the judge asked if he had anything to say to the Harrell family, he shook his head and said softly, "You already took everything from me." It wasn't remorse. It was possession, as if her story still belonged to him. For Lena Harrell, the youngest sister, who had been 19 when Lena disappeared, the verdict didn't bring joy. She said later it felt like watching a ghost get a parking ticket, technical, necessary, but not enough. Justice isn't designed to make sense of grief. It just keeps it from spreading. After the sentencing, she drove straight from the courthouse to Cherry Creek Trail. It was a warm day, the water running high with spring melt. The trail looked smaller than she remembered. She parked near the same spot where Lena's car had been found and stood for a long time, listening to the water move under the bridge. She thought about how her sister had seen this same current through the lens of her camera, looking for reflections, not warnings. She pulled a Polaroid from her pocket, the last photograph Lena ever printed, fog rolling over the creek, soft, silver light. She held it up until the sun faded the image to near white. Then she let it go, the wind carrying it downstream. Detective Monroe closed the file a week later. The red ink note from Elliot Sloan Keep for future testing stayed taped inside the lid. She visited his grave, a small marker in Lakewood Memorial, and left a copy of the arrest report weighted down with a flat stone. "Looks like you were right," she said. Then she went back to the office, opened another box, and started again. That's what justice really is, not fireworks, not applause. Just persistence with paperwork. The Denver Post ran a long feature on the case titled, "The Mailman Who Never Left." It described how Kincaid had lived among the same neighbors for decades, coaching Little League, handing out candy on Halloween, bringing in the newspaper for the elderly couple next door. The article quoted one of those neighbors, a woman named Irene Walsh, who said, "He used to wave every morning. I still wave out of habit, even now. Sometimes I catch myself doing it and feel sick." After the story ran, people began leaving flowers and photographs along the creek again. Not just for Lena, but for what she represented, a reminder that evil doesn't always look like the monster under the bed. Sometimes it wears a uniform and carries your mail. Later that year, the city renamed the stretch of trail Harrell Walk. The dedication was quiet, no speeches, no cameras. Just Dana, a few former detectives, and a small bronze plaque that reads, "For Lena, who saw the light in everything, and for those who never stopped looking." Visitors often leave Polaroids instead of flowers. Landscapes, sunsets, reflections on water. They weather fast, curling at the edges, but new ones keep showing up. It's become a ritual, seeing what she once saw and holding it still for a moment. The only piece of evidence that never found resolution was the camera. Police tore apart Kincaid's house, his storage shed, the postal depot, even a nearby storage unit rented in his name in the 90s. Nothing. But in the attic, inside a box of Christmas decorations, they found a single undeveloped roll of film. It was water-damaged, brittle, impossible to process without destroying it. The label, written in shaky pen, said one word: creek. The lab tried twice. Both attempts failed, but a fragment emerged, a smudge of light across dark water, an almost human shape at the edge of frame. Forensic experts said it could be anything: a reflection, a shadow, a trick of exposure. But Monroe thought otherwise. She believed Lena had taken that shot seconds before she died. A final act of instinct, her camera still between her and the world, still searching for beauty even as danger closed in. Dana never asked to see the fragment. She said she preferred to remember her sister's work the way it was meant to be seen, alive, deliberate, unfinished. She visited Cherry Creek once a year, on the anniversary of the arrest. She brought her daughter, now 16, and they sat by the water in silence. Sometimes the girl would take her phone out, angle it toward the reflection, and whisper, "I think she'd like this one." The headstone in Pueblo was updated after the conviction. Beneath Lena Marie Harrell, 1,959 1,983 are two new words: found at last. Visitors leave coins and small camera charms. The groundskeeper says the plot is never bare, even in winter. And somewhere in the Denver evidence vault, box 83147 remains sealed. Inside it, one leather strap, one red ink note, one undeveloped roll of film. The items are cataloged, but no one plans to reopen them. Some stories reach their end, not when all questions are answered, but when there's finally nothing left to say. So, the creek runs on. The light keeps changing, and a city that once turned away from the darkness now pauses, every so often, to look. That's the story of Colorado 1,983, the cold case that wouldn't die, the arrest that shocked Denver, and the photograph that refused to fade. If you believe the past never really stays buried, make sure you're subscribed. Because here, we keep digging until the light hits truth.